Hello and welcome to Happy Hour on April 2nd. This is a special date as I am actually flying out of town tomorrow. So we're going to slip a little one in here on Easter Monday. I also will be away next week. So keep in mind there will be no happy hours next week, but then I will be returning and you'll be stuck with me again. So this is our time to talk all things craft. And I wanted to take a little bit of time today and actually talk about feedback, because feedback is such a critical part of the loop that we go through. One of the hardest things for me to sort of learn, and I might just be a slow learner, was when I started writing, I would get in there, I would write a draft, and it would never be quite as good as it was when it was just an idea or in my head. So I would abandon that project and I would start something all over again. This led to, give or take, dozens of started novels that would sort of peter out anywhere from, really early on, sort of 10, 15 pages, to books that I would get, 100 to even 200 pages in, and eventually would realize oh, it's just not that good, and stop. So what I had to realize was, of course it's not good. It's a first draft. Now that seems very basic now, but at the time, it certainly wasn't basic for me, and I did not understand that concept. Eventually, I would learn that and I would start completing drafts. But once you complete a draft, you have to fix it. So we will spend some time at some point talking about what you can do for yourself and sort of your own first round of revisions. But I wanted to talk about the process of feedback. So the first part is taking some time and thinking about what kind of feedback is it that you want. So a lot of us talk about, we want really honest feedback, and we do. But for some of us, when we get that really raw and honest feedback, that can be really painful. Writing is a personal process. Some people even use the term, I've been working on my baby and that kind of thing. And when you use those terms, you have to understand if someone says your baby's ugly, malformed, and not working correctly, that can be really painful. There are individuals, I'm not one of them, that can take any kind of feedback at any time and just roll with it. But do spend some time asking yourself, what is it that I need? And for me, I need a balance. I need to know, especially in those early drafts, what's working as well as what's not working. For me, that's two parts. One is I need to keep my spirits up so I don't feel like playing in traffic. And it's also because if I know what's working well, I can build on that. And sometimes I actually don't know what's working well, or my perception of what's working really well isn't. So don't be afraid to be very honest when you're asking for feedback about what kind it is that you're looking for, that you're wanting the whole unvarnished truth, that you want to know what's working. Maybe you're at a draft where all you want to know is what's working, or you're looking for very specific things. I want to know if you like this character, or you're wanting to know if the story plot line is overall working. So there may be very specific things that you're wanting people to drill down on. And don't be afraid to ask for those very specific things, or to be telling people, I'm not ready for certain kinds of feedback. That's completely and totally appropriate. Then comes the big question, when do you get that feedback? And this, again, is very personal. If anyone has read the book Stephen King's On Writing, and if you haven't, I don't know what you're doing with your life. You really need to read that book. But one of the things that he talks about is writing with the door closed. So for him, the concept, idea, and first draft is all a very personal process. He's doing that completely on his own. He's not seeking feedback. He's not wanting feedback in that process. Other people belong to critique groups where as they're writing every single week, they're bringing in a new chapter and they're getting feedback on that. And then there are people like me who are somewhere in the middle. I often will talk with people and brainstorm and get feedback on idea stages. And I'm an outliner, so I tend to do kind of a bit of an outline before I start writing. So I often will talk with people in that outline stage and sort of say, are there big gaps that are missing? Are there big questions that you have? Now, sometimes they're raising issues that I've actually already thought about. I just hadn't thought to put it in the outline. But sometimes they're asking key questions. I just recently have started to sort of tinker around with the new idea. And when talking about it with someone else, she said, well, why wouldn't the character do X? And it was this moment of sort of like, I have no idea. I don't know why the character is not doing that. And as soon as you said that, now I realize they would definitely be giving that some thought and some consideration. And so I have to come up with a reason why they would not take what's a fairly obvious course of action. So I'm very appreciative to Serena Robar out there, a great YA writer, for giving me a little bit of a head sight and insight into my character around what I might want to think about. But for me, when I am writing, when I am in that draft stage, then I go full Stephen King. I shut the door. Until I get through that draft, I can't share it. If I do, what I find happens is that I get much more easily swayed by other people's opinion. In that early draft, things are still very squishy for me. So the characters' motivations aren't exactly clear. What it is they're trying to accomplish may not be clear. Where the story's going may not even be clear. Again, I have an outline, but I'm a big believer in flexibility. So that outline does change and changes quite frequently. So if I have too many people sort of interjecting at that stage, then for me, I can get that messed up. So for me, I invite people in the opening stage. I close the door to write that draft. And then when it is now time that I have a draft, then I open it back up. I typically get feedback in a couple different stages. So again, feedback at the start, maybe from 2 or 3 people as to the idea. Then I write the book. Then I go through that first draft 100% by myself. Now, I print that out. I know that's not very eco-friendly, and I apologize to the trees. But for me, I can't see something often on the screen. I need to see it on the page. So it also may be an element of wanting to see that big giant stack of paper, because that's kind of the first sense of accomplishment that you get. And when you print that out and you see this big fat stack, it feels like, I did it. I wrote a book, damn it. And for me, that's hugely important. So for me, I print it out. I sit down in my comfy chair and I go through that book with a pen at my hand. I'm typically reading it twice. The first time, sort of almost just for enjoyment, because I haven't been in it for a couple of days. So I'm reading it for enjoyment and also making notes. And then again, when I've been all the way through it, then I'm often going through with Post-it notes and my ye old handy yellow pads, and marking various sections that I know I want to revise and so forth. I'm going to pause this just for a second and yell at my dogs. Dogs sufficiently yelled at, so we can go back. So I was saying I printed off, then I'm reading, then I'm making those notes. Then I'm going through and doing a complete rewrite in many cases, or certainly a very big polish. And that's when I will then get my first round of readers. In an ideal world, I like to get 2 to 3 readers. It does depend. Be aware that when you're asking for someone to read your novel and offer feedback, you're asking for a pretty big favor. It takes a lot of time away possibly from their own writing if they are a writer themselves, time away from reading stuff that they may choose to read versus something that you're writing. And even if they're not a writer, it's a big commitment to ask someone to do that. So, be aware of that and try and ask with some degree of caution, I guess. So I try to get 2 or 3 people, but it does depend on where people are. I'm lucky enough to have sort of a fairly large circle at this point. So I'll sort of look around and see, is someone on deadline? And if so, then not them. If they're not on deadline, maybe they can squeeze it in. And different people are better for different types of feedback, so that can be helpful. Then I get all of their notes. I go through, I make those revisions. And then again, in an ideal world, I get another couple of readers. Sometimes this does depend on your timeline and how close you are if you are on a deadline. If you're not on a deadline, I know there's this huge desire to just be done, but do slow down. The books do get better when we take the time to make them better. So don't feel that you have to rush it. So I get that next round of people. Then for me, my book goes off to my agent, the divine Barbara Poel. She takes a look through that. For me, she often has feedback, which means another round of revisions. And then off to my editor for yet another round of revisions. Now, as someone who does freelance editing, sometimes people will say, well, just give me all the notes and then I'll make all the fixes at once. And I don't need to do these multiple rounds. That seems ridiculous. The example that I often give is it's a little bit like home repair. So if you go into a house that you plan to renovate and there are major cracks through the foundation, the ceiling is caving in, the bathroom is spewing raw sewage, like those are the things you have to address first because the place is at risk of falling down or potentially needs to be bulldozed down. It's only once you fix those things that you look around and you think, oh, like this place needs a new coat of paint. And you know what, if we knocked the wall down between the living room and the kitchen, it would open the space up. It would be so much better. And only when you do that round of revisions can you start seeing things like, oh, the baseboards are really dirty and the windows need to be washed. And I wonder if we picked a different wallpaper in the bathroom, if it would look better. So each time that you do that revision, it allows you to see things that might be at a smaller level. So your baseboard's not being dusted, it's not a big deal. You still want to dust them, but you're not going to notice the dust on them if your ceiling is currently caving in. And that's what I think edits and revisions are like. It's people coming in and helping you do those revisions, do those renovations. And as you do each layer of those renovations, you unearth new things. That doesn't mean that your readers missed it or that they were wrong. It just meant that they couldn't see it at the time because they were focused on something else. So something to keep in mind. So we talked a little bit about what to ask for. You can get very, very specific at this stage when you're done with a full draft, or if you're someone who's going, sort of chapter by chapter, if you're that type of person. That sounded judgmental. Sorry about that. If you're the kind of person who likes to get feedback as you go, you can be very specific. So you can say things like, what did you think the character's motivation is? And it can be very interesting to hear what people say. So asking more of that open-ended question. So instead of saying, did you agree with their motivation to get revenge on their mother? Ask them, what did you see as their motivation in this scene? That opens it up because they may see something that you did not intend or something that you didn't even know you were intending, but has shown up on the page. So that can give you some really interesting insight. Now, what to do with feedback. So the first part is to sit on it a little bit. Again, some of it may sting. You may have a situation where you feel like someone has hurt your feelings, maybe gone too far, been cruel. It can happen. Choosing wisely, again, makes some difference who you're asking for feedback. There are, unfortunately, people in this world who like to score points by being right. And you don't need that in your writing. You don't need someone to tell you what to write. What you need is someone to tell you where the story wasn't working for them. And the first biggest hurdle that you decide when you get that feedback is if something wasn't working for them, is that because it's not working or because it's not working for them? And that's a very different thing. This is why I often like to get 2 or 3 readers if I can, because if I have 2 or 3 readers, if they're all saying it's a problem, then it's probably a problem. If one person's saying it's a problem, it may just be that reader. Ultimately, and I do believe this 100%, this is your story. And I cannot stress that enough. If someone is telling you they hate a particular character, but you love that character and you know in your heart this story is about that character, then you have to stay true to that. Now, that doesn't mean you aren't going to take a little bit of a look at that and do some thinking about whether or not you want to do some modifications. So if you have a character that other people are finding unlikable, and I tend to do this, I tend to like complicated, messed up people. More than you might imagine. So for me, sometimes it's going back and layering in, making sure their motivation is very clear so people understand why they're maybe making some not great decisions. So that may be part of the process for me, or layering in other things that might make that character just a little bit more likable. So those are some of the things that you're doing. But sitting with that feedback is pretty important, and just giving yourself some time. Again, some of it is easy. They're going to point out a timeline and inconsistency. You said this was going to happen on a Friday, and it happened on a Thursday. So any of those things, and you can go through and make those changes. So where do you find feedback readers? This is a fun process. Part of that is deciding what kind of feedback that you want. If you are asking other writers for feedback, they're going to have um, some of the skills. So they may be able to say things like, your point of view is shifting here. If you're asking people who are readers, so people who might just be family or friends, not just, but you know what I mean, family or friends, then they may not have those terminology. They may just say, I felt confused in this scene and I didn't know why. A writer is much more likely to be able to identify what structurally you may have going on. Um, Both are useful. Having non-writers involved is useful because writers, I think we can't help ourselves. We want to tinker. Whenever I read someone else's story, I almost can't help myself from thinking like, what would I do with this if I was writing it? And it's not my story. So a reader is much less likely to tinker. They're much more likely, however, to have a little bit vaguer feedback. Getting feedback from people who read your genre is really useful. So if you're writing a mystery novel, ask people you know who are mystery writers or readers. Ask if you're writing YA, are you getting some teen readers to take a look through your book? That's a useful process. I remember when I was writing my first YA, I had a scene where one character was emailing her best friend, and one of my early teen readers wrote back to me, like, I would email my grandma, but I would never email a friend. I would text her. And that's when I realized that A, I was old, and B, I needed to check some of those things out. So make sure you are checking with people who read in that genre. If you're not sure how to find them, I think one of the best places to check is your library. You may even be able to put up a sign on the library bulletin board looking for mystery writers to read early draft. If you're looking for writers, there are tons of online writing groups. There is the Creative Academy, so you can be asking other members here. If anyone's interested in a critique group, that's certainly appropriate. You can be talking to, there are a lot of associations, so if you write for kids, there's the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, there's a Science Fiction Association, there's Sisters in Crime, there's a ton of organizations that are designed to help writers come together, so you can certainly check out any of those, and that would be very appropriate. You may have local writing groups. Here locally, there's the North Shore Writers Association and several others. There are a lot of online groups now that have sprung up, so certainly just doing a click for any online critique groups will probably help you connect up with people. Conferences are a great way. Everyone knows I'm a huge fan of the Surrey conference, but there are certainly many other great conferences happening all around the country and the world, and those conferences can be a great place to connect up with other writers. So those are sort of the stages of feedback. So thinking about first what kind of feedback that you want to get, thinking about when you want to get that feedback, thinking about what to do with that feedback once you have it. The last thing I want to address is the idea of, do you need a professional editor? So this is one of those ironic things because, full disclosure, I do freelance editing. So obviously I do see a value in it. Having said that, I want to be really clear, you do not have to pay to have an editor. When I submitted my first novel, I didn't do that. I didn't have the money for it at the time. I didn't know someone who was doing it. I'm really old, so when I was doing this, there wasn't as much happening online, and I wasn't really certain how to find someone. So I would never want someone to feel, I would hate if a writer felt, you know, I'm never going to be able to push forward because I can't afford an editor. That's not true. You may have to get more rounds of feedback. The process may take somewhat longer, but you definitely can get there. Now, if you are in a position where you can afford a freelance editor, that's a useful process. That person's not your friend. They're not your family. They're much more likely to maybe give you a bit more objectivity. You should feel free to ask for references. Most editors I know will go through sort of 5 or 10 pages and give you a little bit of quote unquote free feedback if you're looking for that, so you can sort of get a sense. Make sure you know what kind of feedback you're going to get for your money. So for example, what I focus on is what I call story edits. So as I read a manuscript, I'm making notes using track changes in Word as I read, and then I do an editorial letter, which is a summary of my sort of thoughts and feelings. Some people are only getting a summary letter. Some people are getting that notes, which are called line notes. Now, I don't do copy edits, although I do try and mark things when I notice them, but I'm not overall going through and looking for things such as that should have been a comma or that needed to be a semicolon. That's not where my focus is. If grammar is a challenge for you, you may want to hire an additional copy editor or someone who can do that for you. But a freelance editor can sort of give you that outside scoop. If you are planning to indie publish or self-publish, I would strongly encourage you to look at getting an editor, both a story editor and a copy editor. You're competing with completed manuscripts. You are competing with professionally polished manuscripts, and you want yours to look as good as possible. So that's definitely a step I would highly encourage you to do. But again, don't feel like you have to. All right, so that is going to be our happy hour for the day. Thanks to everybody for listening in. If you have questions about feedback, you can always email those off to me. Again, a reminder, I will not be here next week, but then I will be returning back to our regular scheduled time and place. And I look forward to seeing everybody then. And until then, happy writing.